Throughout history, rich and/or powerful men had concubines in their lives. The most common word phrase in respect to the existence of concubines is, "King so-and-so kept many concubines." In most cases, this is exactly the right phrase, for most of the women who were concubines were not there by choice. The word concubine has several definitions and many connotations. The easiest way to define the Chinese type of concubinage, at least among the very rich and the imperial family, was that they were mistresses. For many women throughout history, the word concubine meant sexual slavery, from the most horrid and unpleasant sort of existence to that which at least provided shelter, food, and perhaps a modicum of safety, especially in times of war. No matter what the situation, much depended on the personality of the man holding the concubine in this type of bondage. Mean man, poor treatment. Good man, good treatment. Concubinage in China differed in many ways from that of other nations, though it did have similarities as well. At the very top, in the Imperial Household, there was sisterhood, rivalry, palace intrigue, and much more. This likely took place at the home of rich men too.
Yes.
In the Imperial China, which lasted until the Communist Revolution of 1949, a man could have only one wife, but as many concubines as he could afford to house, clothe, and feed. Frequently, in Chinese history and that of other nations, a man's wealth and power were partly judged by the number of concubines he kept and how they lived. Likely the most famous system of concubinage existed within the Chinese imperial family, likely going back at least 2,000 years to the Han dynasty, which lasted from 25 AD to 220 AD. The law then, and going forward to 1949, was that the higher the rank of the man, the more concubines he was able to have. Since Han times and likely before, a concubine could be bought at a slave market in the earliest times, or from a family with an attractive daughter who needed money to survive. These are just two examples. In many cases, a wife would have to approve of this transaction. History is full of tales of Chinese wives mistreating their husband's concubine or concubines, sometimes addressed as little sister, with a number attached in case of multiple women. That was a common occurrence, but likely as common was a good relationship, especially in a bad marriage. A concubine/mistress could take the attention and pressure off a wife and allow her her own time, even more so in a household with multiple concubines. There were no ceremonies connected with being a concubine. That was reserved for the wife. Wives brought a dowry, money from the bride's family to the groom, to the marriage. Concubines did not. Money, when it did flow, was paid by the man, or his representative in the case of the emperor or other member of the imperial court. Once a concubine, a woman could not marry, for good, and if her master died, she could not return home, though it is likely in the long history of China that there were a good many exceptions to these rules. A woman, and yes, many of them were quite young, perhaps young adolescents, could be a concubine to the emperor, or one of the royal princes, or other members of the emperor's family or inner circle. No matter who the concubine was to serve, and while her primary purpose was sexual, at the level of the imperial court, she was expected to be much more than just attractive. Before they would be accepted as a concubine, there was quite a rigorous process that a woman had to pass through. Although it's likely that the vast majority of the candidates conformed to a certain ideal of beauty, they also had to possess intelligence, discipline, and good health. That's not all. Their mannerisms, voice, and body language all had to conform to the ideal of the time, or at least the ideals of the man considering them. At the highest level, a candidate would have to be witty, conversational, and have a basic or extensive knowledge of accepted Chinese morals and philosophy. Naturally, most of the candidates for concubine in the imperial household were not peasants dragged out of the fields. They were likely daughters of high-ranking officials or merchants that could educate their daughters, at least to an extent. At the very end of the process, which could take up to a year for a promising candidate, a series of tests were given, academic tests. Only then would they be offered to the emperor or other powerful man in person. This final stage might or might not involve a test of a more intimate kind, and lessons of that sort had likely been provided, either through observation, by learning from the servants that ran the household, or even by explicit texts. Of course, there were likely exceptions either way. A stunning woman who was not so bright might be accepted, and one that was less attractive but with charisma might as well. It should be remembered that despite living in luxury, the word for concubine was kie, which means female slave. The concubines of the emperor were not allowed to enter the Forbidden City, the heart of the imperial household and government, without written permission of the emperor, and unless she had been given written permission as the emperor's favorite, she could not approach him. He had to summon her. And, of course, power games within the community of concubines meant that being the favorite might only be temporary. Incidentally, historically, the word harem only refers to concubines kept in the Ottoman Empire, though it had come to mean groups of women available to a man for sex. The primary purpose of the concubine was to have sons. Sons born to the emperor and a concubine were considered part of the royal family and would grow up in privilege. They would not be considered illegitimate, but they would be of lower rank than a son born to the emperor's wife. There are, however, cases in history where the sons of concubines rose to become emperors themselves, through favoritism, civil strife, etc. One of the most controversial and well-known aspects of being a concubine in Imperial China, and for that matter among Chinese women of the upper and later upper middle class, was foot binding. Foot binding is the literal binding of the foot so tightly in girlhood or young adolescence that the foot never properly grows. The toes curl under the ball of the foot and become useless. This was, for various reasons throughout history, considered beautiful and a sign of wealth and refinement. The practice went in and out of fashion over the centuries, but was in fashion among the upper class at the turn of the 20th century, and was made illegal by the nationalists in 1912, and reinforced by the communists after their takeover in 1949. Foot binding essentially left women crippled and unable to walk without a cane or other assistance. It also went a long way towards preventing escape. The most famous concubine in Chinese history did not live in the distant past, but lived until 1908. What's more, she essentially ruled China for much of her later life. This was the Empress Dowager Cixi. She was born in 1835 and became a lower concubine of Emperor Jianfeng. Cixi was lucky, as the son she bore for the emperor was his only male heir and became Emperor TONGZHI after his father's death. The emperor was only 6 years old, and the empire was ruled by a council of regents, until Cixi and a Shen, the emperor's first concubine, along with the former emperor's brother Gong, staged a coup, which removed the regents and put them in charge, though it was quite clear that Cixi and the emperor's uncle Gong were the real power. Shen preferred a life of learning, art, and poetry. Though she comes in for much criticism, mostly due to the corruption that existed in China during her reign and the inroads made by foreign nations into China, Cixi and Gong steered the country through some of the bloodiest events in modern history, the Taiping and Nian rebellions, which cost millions of lives, and even harnessed the power of another, the Great Boxer Rebellion of 1899 to 1901, until it went down to defeat at the hands of the Western powers and allied Chinese warlords. Emperor TONGZHI died after only 2 years on the throne, and when he did, Cixi adopted her nephew of royal blood and outmaneuvered Shen and Gong to have her nephew put on the throne as Emperor GUANGXU. GUANGXU ruled with the advice of his mother from 1889 to 1898, but was then pushed aside by her and made a figurehead. Real power in the most populous nation in the world lay in the hands of the former concubine until she died in 1908. Though concubinage still exists in many forms throughout the world, it is also illegal, but exceedingly hard to enforce. It even exists, to a degree, in the United States, where young, attractive women can attract a rich or powerful married or single man as a sugar daddy, and even advertise for one on the internet.